And first up at 6, our team of reporters continue to uncover breaking developments in this case. Mike DeForest is showing us why the Anthony family doesn't believe the evidence. But we begin with Tony Pipitone, who is digging through a new request to dismiss the charges against Casey Anthony. Tony.
Yeah, Jacqueline, the defense today unleashed these two broadsides on the prosecution, much of it based on the lack of physical evidence we've been exposing in the last week. Without more evidence of Casey Anthony's guilt, they're asking the judge to dismiss the murder and child abuse charges against her, or at least block the state from seeking the death penalty. Defense attorneys Andrea Lyon and Jose Baez today argued enough is enough. The circumstantial evidence in this case shows nothing more than a suspicion of Miss Anthony's guilt, they argue, in calling for dismissal of the murder and child abuse charges. The prosecution, they say, cannot prove how Kaylee Anthony died, let alone that she was a victim of homicide. They point out the medical examiner who ruled the death a homicide by undetermined means, found no trauma and no drugs with the body. Also, duct tape found around Kaylee's skull near where this tape was in the woods was contaminated by the FBI lab and shows no signs of Casey. They even point out a hair found with this World of Disney bag and Gatorade bottle right next to the skull is not a hair from Kaylee or Casey. The defense is asking Judge Stan Strickland to toss out the charges, but if he doesn't, they at least want the death penalty taken off the table, and they attack the prosecution for seeking it. Given the inflammatory media and extensive community involvement in this case, the prosecution is undoubtedly being pressured to convict Miss Anthony, which is why they say prosecutors sought death, so jurors chosen for trial will be more prone to convict. Its motivation lies not in legitimately seeking justice, but in stacking the deck against Miss Anthony. And they say that because death-qualified juries leave off those people who say they could not vote to execute another person. So those juries tend to be tougher on accused criminals. But lawyers we talked to today say the motion to preclude the death penalty has very little chance of success. Prosecutors are giving great leeway in Florida to seek death and then let the jury decide. Of course, a judge can always override a jury's verdict at the end of the case.
Tony, let's talk about the motion to possibly dismiss these charges. Does that even stand a chance?
I talked to a former prosecutor who says it can be easily defeated by the prosecutor who simply goes to court and does what's called a traverse. It basically means the defense can claim the state doesn't have enough evidence. The state says, oh, yes, we do. It's almost like kids bickering. And the state usually wins, even if it has, the flimsiest of evidence. And, of course, it goes to trial.
But then the judge could throw out the charges?
Always at the end of the state's case, a judge can look at it and say, this shouldn't even go to the jury and toss it out.
Okay, thanks, Tony.
Tony, thank you.
And there are even more new developments from the Anthony family attorney. Local 6's Mike DeForest picks up that part of the story live in East Orange County. Mike.
Mike, for months, the FBI crime lab has been analyzing evidence that was found out here in the woods off Suburban Drive to see if it matches any of the evidence that was collected from the Anthony family's home just a couple blocks away from here. Today, George and Cindy Anthony's attorney held a press conference to basically point out that so far there is no conclusive link between the two scenes. George and Cindy Anthony want you to know there are weaknesses in the state's case against their daughter, and they've dispatched their attorney to highlight those weaknesses.
She's presumed to be innocent, and give her that opportunity.
Brad Conway points to this FBI lab report suggesting that duct tape found on a gas can inside the Anthony family's garage is different than the duct tape wrapped around Kaylee Anthony's skull. The report states that the fabric portion of the duct tape samples is microscopically dissimilar and not consistent with originating from the same source.
In the past, the speculation has been same roll of duct tape, emanating from the same source, which would have been the Anthony home. That's now called into question.
But a previously released FBI lab report seems to contradict that conclusion. When the lab examined the chemical composition of the duct tape samples, the FBI determined that they did originate from the same source roll of tape or tape manufactured in the same manner.
The links are being questioned, and those links are what's called reasonable doubt.
Conway believes the most compelling evidence in favor of Casey Anthony's innocence is this FBI lab report. It states that the duct tape found around Kaylee Anthony's skull does not contain any fibers, such as carpet fibers, that can be matched to either the Anthony's home or Casey Anthony's car.
If there is no match, there is no link.
But keep in mind, the FBI lab has found very little usable evidence stuck to that tape, perhaps because the tape had deteriorated while exposed to the elements in the woods. There are no fingerprints on the tape, no blood, not even DNA from Kaylee, even though the tape was wrapped around her face. But even though the tape did not contain Kaylee's DNA, as Local 6 first reported earlier this week, the FBI did discover DNA on that duct tape from 2 other people. Now, the agency was able to determine that some of that DNA came from one of the FBI analysts who actually handled the tape after taking it out of the woods here. But there is a second piece of DNA on that duct tape, and at this point, there's no explanation as to who that DNA belongs to. Reporting live along Suburban Drive, Mike DeForest, Local 6.